The ballroom glistened in gold and ivory under the chandeliers of the Capitol Grand Hotel. The event was meant to be elegant, a fundraising gala hosted by high-ranking Democrats, headlined by none other than Nancy Pelosi herself. The elite were out in full force. Hollywood donors, D.C. strategists, media powerhouses, all raising glasses and praising each other for saving democracy. But there was one chair in the back that no one noticed. It was occupied by a young conservative firebrand with a straight back, a navy blue suit, and a cross necklace that glinted every time the lights hit her collarbone. Karoline Leavitt. She hadn't been invited, but someone leaked her a ticket, and Karoline had no intention of letting the evening slide by with speeches soaked in hypocrisy. Not tonight. Pelosi, standing tall on the stage, was midway through her address. "This nation," she said with practiced calm, "is finally healing from the damage done by extremists, the chaos agents, the right-wing radicals who worship authoritarianism over democracy." The crowd erupted in applause. Karoline didn't move. Pelosi continued, voice dripping with condescension. "We must never again let this country fall into the hands of those who wear flags on their lapels but hold hatred in their hearts." Another round of cheers. Pelosi smiled, and then her eyes landed on Karoline, and the smile faltered. Karoline stood up. A low ripple of murmurs swept the room. Security glanced around, unsure. Guests turned their heads. Karoline's voice rang out, not from a microphone, but with clarity that cut through the polished silence like glass shattering. "Is this the part," she said, "where the queen of corruption lectures the peasants on morality?" Gasps, laughter, then dead silence. Pelosi froze. Karoline didn't. She took a step forward. "You talk about democracy like it's your personal throne, but you've spent decades silencing anyone who didn't kneel." Pelosi tried to signal security, but they hesitated. Cameras were rolling, phones were out. The moment had already gone viral. You locked down cities while you got your hair done in private salons. You pushed policies that bankrupt working families while you raked in millions off insider deals, Karoline said, voice unwavering. A few claps. Someone whispered, "She's not wrong." Karoline narrowed her eyes. "You don't represent the people. You represent power. And tonight, I'm here to remind you, power doesn't mean truth." Nancy took a step back. Karoline took the stage, and the room would never be the same again. The air shifted. What had begun as a well-rehearsed display of Democrat unity now cracked under the weight of one voice, uninvited, unafraid, and unmuzzled. Karoline stood center stage. No podium, no notes. Just conviction. Her voice didn't need amplification. The crowd's attention had already been hijacked. From the front row, Nancy Pelosi leaned toward a nearby aide and hissed, "Who let her in?" Her wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. The cameras, some streaming live, zoomed in as her composure slipped for the first time that night. But Karoline didn't wait for permission. "You call yourselves defenders of democracy," she said, looking across the sea of polished shoes and pearl necklaces, "but you lock Americans in their homes while you toast champagne behind closed doors." Pelosi stepped forward, gripping the mic stand. "This is not your stage, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline didn't blink. "Neither is this your country, Speaker. It belongs to the people, not career politicians who retire richer than CEOs. The room gasped. A few attendees stood, unsure whether to object or leave. Pelosi's voice tightened. "Security?" But Karoline raised her voice louder. "You want me out because I'm exposing you. Because someone like me, young, conservative, and unafraid, wasn't supposed to speak in rooms like this." She pointed directly at Pelosi. "You've spent your life pretending to care about minorities, the poor, and women, but the only woman you ever cared to lift was yourself." The crowd froze. A Hollywood producer whispered, "Oh my God, she just said that." Karoline stepped down from the stage, but she didn't leave. "I'll sit when the truth is heard," she said. Not when the Queen orders it. Pelosi slammed her hand on the podium. This is a private event. Karoline turned back. Then why is the public footing the bill for your lies? Phones recorded every word. Some guests now clapped. Others awkwardly looked around, unsure what side history would favor tonight. An elderly woman in the back wiped a tear. I haven't heard anyone talk like that since Reagan, she whispered. The moment was no longer a protest. It was a reckoning. Pelosi tried to reclaim control the only way she knew how, through force. With tight lips and shaking hands, she reached for the mic Karoline had just used, as if silencing her would undo what the crowd had already witnessed. But before she could speak, Karoline pulled a worn, leather-bound booklet from her bag. She held it up with 2 fingers. The Constitution, she said firmly, eyes locked on Pelosi. Remember that little document, Madam Speaker? The room stilled. Even the sound tech froze mid-adjustment. Pelosi snapped, This is not a courtroom, it's a private fundraiser. Karoline stepped forward, standing toe-to-toe with her. It's not a courtroom, but you're still guilty. Gasps rippled across the floor. A man near the stage dropped his fork. You lecture this country about rights, about compassion, about rule of law, Karoline said, flipping open the Constitution. But where were you when churches were chained shut, when small businesses were boarded up, when cities burned? Pelosi scoffed. Don't talk to me about the Constitution. I've served this nation for over 30 years. And that's the problem, Karoline shot back. 30 years of photo ops, insider trading, and backdoor deals, while Americans struggled to fill their gas tanks and buy baby formula. Pelosi turned to the audience, arms outstretched in mock disbelief. She's grandstanding. Karoline's voice didn't budge. I'm standing where you hoped no one would ever stand, between your lies and the truth. Pelosi's face reddened. You have no idea how government works. Oh, I do, Karoline replied, flipping to Article 1. It starts with the people, not the speaker's purse, not the donor class, not the back rooms of D.C. filled with wine and whispers. A loud cheer broke from the left side of the room. Several guests stood. A retired veteran in uniform raised his voice. Let her speak. Karoline looked at him, then back at Pelosi. I don't need your stage, she said. I don't need your approval. I have the First Amendment, and a nation that's wide awake. She handed a folded copy of the Constitution to a young intern standing beside Pelosi. You might want to start reading it. God knows she hasn't. The audience erupted. Phones lit up like stars. Hashtags began trending before Karoline even stepped away. Pelosi stood motionless, clenching the edge of the podium, her legacy unraveling in real time. Karoline didn't drop the mic. She handed it to a woman in the crowd and whispered, Your turn. Nancy Pelosi let out a forced chuckle. Well, she certainly has a flair for theatrics, she quipped, hoping her polished tone would mask the tremble creeping into her voice. Her pearl necklace rested just above a crimson neckline that now seemed a little too tight, a little too revealing. Not in fashion, but in fear. But the room wasn't laughing. A woman in the back whispered, Did she just dodge everything again? A middle-aged man holding a worn cap that read Vietnam Vet muttered, Same old game. Pelosi leaned into the mic, voice rehearsed. Let's not let this evening get derailed by a political stunt. Karoline didn't flinch. She had stepped off the stage and stood now at ground level, her eyes sweeping across the faces of everyday Americans who had stopped eating, stopped chatting, stopped pretending. I didn't derail anything, Karoline said. You derailed the American dream, for millions. She turned, pointing slowly at the rows of silent donors and invited guests. You laughed when cities burned. You smiled while mandates crushed family businesses. You toasted your ice cream fridge while mothers couldn't find baby formula. And now you want us to forget? Pelosi narrowed her eyes. This isn't the floor of Congress. This is a celebration. Karoline stepped closer. No, it's a reckoning. The word echoed. Karoline pulled out her phone and held it high. A photo flashed on the screen, a small-town bakery boarded up. Then another, a mother crying on a curb with eviction papers in her hand. And another, Charlie Kirk in front of a folded flag. "This is your legacy," Karoline said, her voice steady but rising. Not empowerment, not progress, but collapse, wrapped in silk and sold with a grin. A man near the bar stood up. "She's right. You left us behind." Pelosi's grip on the podium tightened. "You're all being manipulated," she said, eyes darting for control. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're not scared of me," she said quietly. "You're scared of them, waking up." A slow ripple of applause began. One table, then two, then the whole room. Pelosi turned to her aide. "Shut it down," she whispered. Karoline caught it. "No," she said. "You've shut down too many things already. Churches, schools, voices. But not tonight." She raised her hand, not in defiance but in declaration. "I speak for those who don't get invited to these events, for truckers, for farmers, for families forgotten by a ruling class that eats lobster while children eat cereal for dinner." The standing ovation that followed didn't come with champagne glasses. It came with tearful eyes, raised fists, and a room that finally remembered what courage looked like. Pelosi didn't laugh again. The moment Nancy Pelosi stepped off the stage, she expected her entourage to form a protective circle. But the crowd had shifted. Her usual buffer of elite donors and media allies had thinned. They weren't following her anymore. They were watching Karoline. Karoline wasn't done. She cut across the room with purpose, her heels echoing against the marble floor like a drumbeat of defiance. She moved through the crowd like a storm in slow motion, precise, direct, unshaken. Pelosi saw her coming and tried to exit stage left. But Karoline was faster. She stepped in front of her, not with rage, not with some teenage rebellion, but with the full, grounded presence of a woman who knew exactly why she was there. "Nancy," she said, just loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "we're not done." Pelosi's aide stepped in. "She's not taking questions." Karoline turned to him slowly. "She's not taking accountability either." The room fell deathly still. Pelosi gave a tight smile. "This isn't the place for a debate, dear." Karoline's eyes didn't blink. "That's your problem. You think America's a stage you get to walk off from when the questions get hard." She pulled a folder from her bag. Plain, unbranded, no press logo, no fancy binding. Just truth in black and white. She opened it and held up a page. 2020. You called lockdowns essential. But your private hair salon appointment? That wasn't essential. The crowd murmured. 2021. You said, follow the science. But when kids with disabilities were kept out of schools while your donors kept getting exemptions, what science was that? More whispers. Then audible agreement. Karoline stepped closer. You say you stand for women. So why did you stay silent when girls were kicked out of sports they trained for their whole lives? Pelosi clenched her jaw. This is harassment. Her aide snapped. Karoline lifted a hand to silence him. This is accountability, she shot back. And if she can't face one woman in a room full of Americans, how did she ever face China? Or the cartels flooding our streets? Or the corruption bleeding our economy dry? Pelosi tried to cut her off. You're nothing but a mouthpiece for outrage. No, Nancy, Karoline said coldly. I'm what you were too afraid to become. Someone who tells the truth when it's dangerous. The cameras caught it. Every angle, every line. And then Karoline pulled something else from her bag, not a document this time, but a small American flag. Faded, folded, the kind you get at a soldier's funeral. This was Charlie's, she said, holding it up. You remember him, don't you? The one your side called radical, the one who believed too much in the country you swore to serve. A quiet sob came from somewhere in the room. Karoline stepped back and let the silence land like a gavel. Pelosi said nothing. She couldn't. Karoline lowered the flag, looked her in the eye, and whispered, "Sit down, Queen of Corruption. Your reign is over." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. Karoline stood with the flag in one hand, not raised for applause, not held for show, but cradled the way you hold something sacred. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Even the media rows had stopped typing. Pelosi's aides whispered urgently behind her, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Because for once, the narrative wasn't hers to shape. It belonged to someone else now. Karoline turned toward the cameras. "I want every American watching this to remember something. The people who lecture you about democracy the loudest are often the ones who've betrayed it the longest." She slowly unfolded the flag. This isn't just a symbol. This was Charlie's. He carried it in his truck. He prayed with it, folded on his nightstand. He waved it when no one else would, and they called him a threat for it. Karoline pointed to Pelosi. "Your side mocked him. You mocked every young American who stood up for this country, who spoke their convictions, who didn't kneel when you demanded they did." She shook her head slowly, voice tightening. "You call yourselves the defenders of democracy, but you silenced him. You silenced millions like him, and then you called it progress." Pelosi tried to pivot. "This is a political stunt." Karoline didn't flinch. "No, what you do in D.C., that's a stunt. Sending billions overseas while our veterans sleep in cars, that's a stunt. Tearing up speeches on national television like it's theater, that's a stunt." She took a breath and faced the crowd directly. "This is a reckoning." A man in the back, gray-haired, wearing a Vietnam vet pin, stood up. No words, just a nod. Then a woman with a folded flag of her own, eyes full of tears, stood too. One by one they rose. They weren't clapping. They were remembering, mourning, waking up. Pelosi looked around nervously. "You don't understand what it takes to lead." Karoline stepped closer. "And you don't understand what it costs to follow." Then she walked over to the podium, the one Pelosi had fled, and placed Charlie's flag gently on the wood. "I'm not asking for a mic," she said. "I'm asking for something none of you have offered in years, a moment of truth." And for the first time in a long time, the podium didn't belong to a politician. It belonged to a citizen, a fighter, a voice they couldn't mute. And as Karoline looked out at the crowd, veterans, mothers, students, even former Democrats, she didn't yell. She didn't perform. She just asked one question. If they're afraid of our words, what else are they hiding from? The room erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. Truth had taken the microphone, and Karoline wasn't giving it back. As the standing crowd grew behind Karoline, Pelosi did what most politicians do when they lose control. She turned her back and tried to walk away, but the cameras didn't follow Pelosi. They stayed fixed on Karoline, on the flag she had placed on the podium, on the silence she had carved from a room that was never meant to be hers. And then she spoke again. Not louder, just steadier. "You want to walk away, Speaker Pelosi? Walk, but don't you dare pretend this didn't happen." The audience leaned forward. "You spent decades shaping narratives. You spun chaos into slogans. You called riots mostly peaceful and prayer radical. But today, you don't get to rewrite this moment, because I'm not going anywhere." A producer backstage tried to cut the feed, but the network's live stream was already trending. Hashtags with Charlie's name surged. Clips of Karoline's words flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. No matter what team controlled the cameras, the truth had already escaped the building. Pelosi stopped near the curtains, shoulders stiff. Karoline turned directly toward her again. "You called people like Charlie dangerous. You laughed when they were deplatformed. You said they needed to be re-educated." She held up her phone. A photo glowed on the screen. Charlie, smiling, holding that same flag in front of a rusted pickup truck. "This is who you fear. Not a terrorist, not a traitor, just a young man who loved his country more than your approval ratings." The room was frozen. Even the security guards looked unsure of who they were there to protect anymore. Then Karoline walked back to the center. "There's a lie we've been sold," she said, "that the only voices worth hearing are the polished ones, the filtered ones, the ones that know how to please both coasts." She gestured toward the ceiling, the grand chandeliers, the golden seal above. "But this place was built for us, for we, the people, not we the pundits, not we the donors." Her voice dropped lower. "And when someone dies holding a flag, that doesn't make them your talking point. It makes them your responsibility." A slow, almost hesitant applause broke out, not from Karoline's side of the aisle, but from the far left corner. A young staffer no older than Charlie clapped once, then again. Others followed. Pelosi turned around, stunned. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't bask. She simply said, "You turned your back. That's fine. America's turning the page." And with that, she stepped down from the podium, not with a mic drop, but with something louder: conviction. The room didn't recover, because for the first time they had seen what unfiltered truth looked like, and it had walked straight through their script and lit it on fire. Pelosi had expected applause when she stood. What she got instead was silence. Her voice trembled just slightly as she took the mic. "I've served this nation for decades," she began, "and I won't be lectured by someone who thinks TikTok clips and talking points amount to leadership." The attack was thinly veiled, but everyone in the room understood it. She was targeting Karoline directly, minimizing her as young, inexperienced, performative. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just leaned forward, folded her hands over her notes, and waited. Pelosi continued, raising her voice for emphasis. "When you've passed laws, built coalitions, and stared down world leaders, then you can speak about responsibility. Until then, sit down and learn." And that was it. Karoline stood. She didn't wait for applause or permission. She picked up the microphone and said just 5 words, loud, measured, and pointed. "Sit down, Queen of Corruption." Gasps erupted across the room. Phones flew up. Even the moderator froze. Pelosi turned slowly toward her, stunned. Karoline didn't back down. "You talk about leadership," she said, "but what you've really done is lead this country into record debt, moral decay, and institutional rot. You silenced dissent. You crushed opposition. And now you want to pretend you're the victim." She took one step forward, her voice unshaken. "You sold access to power. You traded convictions for influence. And now you're asking us to forget that, because you've aged out of accountability?" The crowd didn't know what to do, cheer or hold their breath. Pelosi opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline cut her off. "No more speeches, Nancy. We've heard them all, and America's done paying the price for your lies." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Pelosi stood frozen. For the first time in a long political career, she looked like she didn't know what to say. And Karoline just stood there, unmoved, unafraid, and fully in control. The room was a battlefield of silence. Pelosi's face, usually composed behind practiced smiles and staged remarks, was drained of its color. Her mouth twitched, like she was searching for the perfect rebuttal. But Karoline had already stolen the stage. And the truth. Reporters whispered. Cameras zoomed. Social feeds erupted. Within minutes, Karoline's 5-word rebuke, "Sit down, Queen of Corruption," was trending globally. Still, Karoline wasn't finished. "I know you're used to walking into rooms where everyone nods like puppets," she said, pacing slowly, deliberately. "But not this time. Not with me." She held up a stack of documents, one by one. "These aren't conspiracy theories. These are FEC records. These are emails. These are testimonies from whistleblowers who served under your command and couldn't sleep at night anymore." She dropped the stack on the table. The thud echoed through the mic. "You say you fought for America, but every time you flew back from Washington, you were a little richer, a little more protected. And the people, they were left behind." Pelosi tried to interject. "That's outrageous." But Karoline cut her off with a single raised hand. "You don't get to interrupt. You had 30 years to speak, 30 years to act. This is my minute now." Karoline turned to the audience. "Her generation handed us a broken country wrapped in fake virtue, but we're not buying it anymore. The American people are awake, and we are not afraid to say what others whisper." She turned back to Pelosi, one last time. "You're not just a relic of corruption. You're its face, and I will not let this country rot just to protect yours." A burst of applause rose, real, uncoached, raw. Karoline placed the mic down, not dropped, not flung, just placed, calm, controlled, and she walked off stage. Pelosi didn't follow. She couldn't. Outside the venue, the crowd had already multiplied. Cameras, reporters, students, veterans, and everyday Americans gathered not for Pelosi's name, but for what Karoline had just done. The hashtag #ShutterQueen of corruption had overtaken every trending list. Not from a PR campaign, not from bots, from Americans who had waited years to see someone say what they always felt, someone unafraid to shatter the shield of power with a single, public truth. Karoline walked down the marble steps. One student shouted, "You said what we all wanted to." Another held up a sign, "No more political royalty." Still in her blazer, the cross glinting on her necklace, Karoline stopped in front of the press unfazed. "Do you think that was respectful?" one reporter sneered, clearly hoping to trap her. She smiled. "Respect is earned, not inherited." A veteran in the back raised his hand and yelled, "God bless you." She raised a hand in return. "God bless the truth." Pelosi's team tried to recover online. A spokesperson tweeted that Karoline disrespected a female political icon. But Karoline replied herself, "She disrespected America first. I just pointed it out." News shows scrambled. Morning panels rewrote their entire scripts. Even networks hesitant to criticize Pelosi couldn't avoid airing the clip. It was raw, it was bold, and it was too real to ignore. In the days that followed, Karoline's words were replayed in classrooms, town halls, and barbershops. She didn't just confront a woman, she confronted a legacy, a dynasty, and she did it without fear, and perhaps most importantly, without apology. Her voice became a call not just for accountability, but for a new kind of leadership. Not polished, not bought, not rehearsed. Karoline proved that one voice armed with courage and truth could tear down a tower of decades-old corruption in under 5 minutes. And as she disappeared into the crowd, one thing was clear. Nancy Pelosi had built a throne of silence. Karoline just flipped the whole table. And just like that, the illusion shattered. For decades, Nancy Pelosi stood atop a platform built not by honor, but by silence, intimidation, and carefully controlled applause. But all it took was one voice, raw, unfiltered, and unafraid, to bring it all crashing down. Karoline Leavitt didn't just speak truth to power, she humiliated it. In a world where corruption hides behind titles, where legacy is mistaken for virtue, and where dissent is branded as disrespect, Karoline reminded America of something we've forgotten, that no one is above the truth. She didn't bow, she didn't blink, and she didn't wait her turn. She stood up and spoke for the millions who were told to sit down. If this moment proved anything, it's that the era of untouchable politicians is over. The American people are watching, listening, and now, finally, speaking through voices like hers. And to those clinging to the old order, you should be afraid, because Karoline isn't the only one standing anymore.